I'm happy to give it to you.
Yeah.
We're not on camera now, are we?
No.
Okay.
Ought to be.
Okay. I won't say
All
anything.
right. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
So, William Powell, now he was a pilot too. In his own
Yes, William Powell. William Powell's fame to life was he was in infantry, and he was during the time of World War I, they were using gas, and he was gassed, and so he was released on a medical and brought back to the States, and he continued to want to learn how to fly, and he was promised that, if he would go into the military, that after he got out the military in World War I, that they would teach him how to fly, but they still didn't. So he went to an instructor there in Chicago, and he asked if he could learn how to fly, and they said, well, we don't teach color to fly, but if you come back at nighttime. And so William Powell said, forget it. So William Powell leaves Chicago. After he had been very successful there, he had built his first gas station and leased 2 others, and he was an automotive repair. See, most of the blacks, and except for Eugene Bullard and Bessie Coleman, the ones I'm going to tell you about, most of these guys were auto mechanics, because aviation, they used engines from cars, and they used motorcycle engines. They didn't have aviation engines at that time because aviation was so new. So most of these people, you'll see that their background was mechanical. So William Powell continues on, and he learned how to fly, of course, and so he had to get a licensed pilot to be his instructor. So he teamed up with James Banning. James Banning is the first African American to receive a pilot license in the United States, which was in 1926. Before 1926, there were no pilot license for anybody. You had to go over to France to get an international pilot license. And that's one of the reasons that Bessie Coleman went to France to get a pilot license, because the United States didn't have pilot license until 1926. So James Banning was that pilot.
What year? What was it that they had them first?
1926.
1926.
That's correct.
Okay.
And that's how you got an aviator's license here in the United States. Before then, all the aviators who were flying before 1926 all had to go to France to get a pilot license, no matter where you came from.
So did you need one to fly in the United States before then?
I don't think so. I think you pretty much just flew because you wanted to fly.
When did driver's licenses come?
I don't know. But I have my father's, and I'll let you take a picture of. I have my father's first pilot license upstairs.
Yeah, so that had to be a new concept brought upon by the advent of the automobile, because I don't think that they were you didn't need a license to ride a horse or drive a wagon.
No,
right?
No, but they did have driver's license, and my mother might be able to give me that answer. But
I know they had a Teamsters union for the wagoneers. I don't know if they had to have a license to.
I want to say that you could go to the supermarket and get your driver's license. You can quote me on that, but I've said it already. But I for some reason, I've heard that somewhere in my family's history that back then you just went to the supermarket and got your driver's license.
As long as you paid.
Some of them drive like they went to the supermarket and got driver's license too, by the way.
So I've been accused of that. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't say that.
All right. So yeah. So
okay. So
James
Banning. So James Banning. James Banning came from Iowa, and there's a history on him. I could carry you on, but I think it would be too lengthy for this interview because each one of them have a story that I can tell you about. So James Banning, I'm just going to give you some summaries to show the connections and show you why we should always respect the heroes before us, because without the heroes before us, there wouldn't be us. So James Banning and William Powell, they were inspired by Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman was inspired by Harriet Quimby and Eugene Bullard. Now we're going to move forward. We're going to go from Banning, and we're going to move forward, and we're going to go into Cornelius Coffey.
That's Coffey.
That's correct. And his partner, John C. Robinson, known as the Black Condor.
Okay.
They learned how to fly on their own. What they did is they took Johnny's car and traded it in on an airplane. And the guy said at the used car lot, he said, you can keep this airplane here until you learn how to fly it. And so they did. They worked on it, and they learned how to fly this airplane by themselves. Now, I'm going to carry you forward from there.
Now, that's got to be frightening, you would think.
It was. Can you imagine that?
Just get in, you don't know what you're doing. You get in a plane
and they have no brakes. See, the airplanes, when I finished telling you the story, the airplanes that they were flying had a drag tail, had only 2 instruments, an altimeter and oil pressure gauge. That's it. So you're talking about flying around trees and whatever you have. At least Illinois is flat, and you don't have to deal with the terrain like you would maybe in Virginia or something like that. But before I get myself off key and forget what I'm trying to tell you,
Okay.
Johnny C. Robinson left, and he went to Ethiopia to start Haile Selassie's Air Force. Have I already told you that? You have that
Yes,
written in it.
yeah,
Okay, so we're going to move forward from there. Johnny Robinson was not part of the National Airmen's Association. Cornelius Coffey and Willa Brown, amongst other individuals, Dale White, Chauncey Spencer, these individuals, wait a minute, I don't want to tell you it like that. These individuals, what they did is they started an organization to interest African Americans in aviation.
Now, was there any other institutional interest in this? And what I mean by that, you mentioned Oscar Dupreece being interested in this, and
Right.
perhaps some of the other black politicians might be interested in having
Right,
black
right.
pilots. Did they support this kind of thing, or was it how did they? Well, just tell us how they got the idea to form this.
How they got the idea? Okay, how they got the idea? They got the idea from Enoch Waters.
Okay, who is he?
Enoch Waters is the editor for the Chicago Defender. And Enoch Waters says, well, listen, if you guys want to get some attention, you need to start and form an organization. This can't be a club. So they formed the National Airmen's Association of America, which was founded in Cook County, August the 16th, 1940, and incorporated in the state of Illinois. And their office was going to be held at 3455 Wabash Avenue, the YMCA in Chicago, Illinois. And that was the headquarters for the National Airmen's Association of America.
National Airmen's Association
of America.
Now, initially it was the Negro
You know a little
Airmen's
something, don't you?
Association.
Yes.
Right.
Well, what happened is, during their discussions, they were going to call it the Negro National Airmen Association of America. But Chauncey Spencer, Dale White, Willa Brown, Cornelius Coffey, they fought. They said, listen, if we're fighting against discrimination, we can't be discriminatory. So they dropped the word Negro, and they just called it the National Airmen's Association of America. And by the way, that organization, not only did it teach African Americans to fly, but it taught white Americans to fly too. And it taught women to fly too. It was the most integrated organization of them all.
And probably the least sexist.
And the least sexist, because you'll see in my story that there was just as many women pilots like Janet Bragg, Willa Brown, Marie Sinclair. There were pilots along with these men.
Okay, now Willa Brown, tell us a little bit about her.
Willa Brown came from, was born in Kentucky and came to Indiana. Her father was a preacher, and he also worked in a factory where they covered creosote on the railroad ties. And she graduated from Northwestern University with and back then they called it teaching college. And she graduated from that with a teaching degree, and she became a teacher. She later on tried her hand in politics. Before all of that, she became the secretary for the National Airmen's Association of America, and she was key in writing the letters to Eleanor Roosevelt to include the Negro in the Civil Pilot Training Program. And I'm telling you stuff here that I haven't even told you what they are, but that's only why I can summarize what she did, because she did quite a bit. Willa Brown was not shy when it came to cameras. Willa Brown was the person that was instrumental in interesting Enoch Waters to support their efforts in Chicago by going to Robert Abbott and saying that this is a worthy cause. We shouldn't charge them for advertisement. We should give them all this PR for free. So that's how they had the PR. And so Willa Brown was a very jazzy looking woman, beautiful. So in Enoch Waters' book, which I have and I'll share with you, it says that when Willa Brown walked into the Chicago Defender, they said all the typewriters stopped clicking. Everybody looked up and she pointed that she wanted to see this guy, and it was Enoch Waters. So Enoch Waters said he did like this, pointed back at himself, and then he says, you know how the song goes, what Lola want, Lola gets? That's how Willa Brown carried her statue. And when Willa Brown left there, Enoch Waters first was not interested in aviation, and when he left there, he went to every single air show and went up in airplanes with them as well. He became that much of a supporter.
Okay.
And it was due to Willa Brown's magnetism.
And so he's the one that suggested that the Black
That they started the organization.
Organized, and
That's right.
when they organized, now, don't let me get too far ahead, but
Sure.
One of the big projects that they came up with was a way to try to promote, blacks in aviation and to get support for black participation in the war effort as pilots.
That's
by
correct.
actually flying across the country, right, from Chicago to D.C.
Right.
It was
Well,
your father
actually,
and Dale White, right?
Yeah, actually, and I'd have to go back again because, see, there were many flights that were farther than that. I mean, Chief Anderson and Dr. Forsyth flew from Los Angeles to Atlantic City, New Jersey, and then flew over to the Bahamas and had to leave the plane over there. So they never got the attention. It just happens to be, and I'd be cutting into my story if I tell you it now, so I don't want to tell you now.
Okay, well, just tell me what comes next.
Okay, what comes next after that? They form the organization. So they decide, now let me tell you this. The Bessie Coleman Aerial Club and the National Airmen's Association of America didn't know about each other. They didn't know that this organization on the West Coast that was trying to do the same thing that this Midwest organization was doing. But they defined the National Airmen's Association of America to be more well-oiled than any of them. So they had this big convention. And before they had this convention, they said, we need to interest the colleges in the South, the black colleges in the South, to get involved in the CPTP. The CPTP stands for the Civil Pilot Training Program. And that program only included whites in it. And it was approved and started by Franklin Roosevelt in December of 1938. It wasn't until they decided to make this flight. Now, on this flight, they didn't know who they were going to meet. So what they did is Enoch Waters went to Mayor Kelly and Governor Dwight Green at the time in Illinois to get support. And Dwight Green said that he would get 2 senators, Everett Dirksen and Senators Slattery, to meet them in Washington. Well, it was during election times. So these guys wanted to get some pictures so they can get this Negro vote. So they wanted to get some pictures with these black pilots. So that they were fine with meeting them out there. And so on their flight, they take off. It's May the 9th, 1939. They take off Harlem Field, 82nd Street and Harlem Avenue.
Now, wait a minute now. Okay, I just want to clarify something
Sure.
before we get them too far.
Sure.
They said this is 1939 when they take off?
That's correct.
Okay, now have they formed the organization yet?
They had already formed the organization.
Okay, so the organization was formed in...
The organization was formed, it was incorporated in, no, okay, they hadn't. They had formed it, but they hadn't incorporated until August the 16th of 1940.
Okay, that's
okay, but it was an organization and it wasn't incorporated until that date.
Oh, okay.
But it was an organization from 1936 up until 1940 when they incorporated.
Okay, all right. That's
so from 1936 at the beginning of this meetings till 1939 when they decided to make this flight, this promotional flight.
Okay, so formed in 36, incorporated in 1940.
That's correct.
Okay,
August 16th.
So they still have an organization and they're waiting for incorporation to go through.
That's correct.
And they leave May the 9th. Go ahead.
1939.
Okay.
They leave Harlem Field in Chicago, Illinois, on their way to Washington. And on their way to Washington, they were met by several obstacles. And one of the obstacles, when they first took off, they were flying over Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they detected they had a gas leak. So they had to land on the road in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they saw this old gas station down there. And back then, they had a glass ball, and you pumped up 5 gallons of gas, and then that's what you got, and then you put it in a bucket, and then you pumped up 5 gallons more. Well, this plane held 50 gallons of gas. Gas weighs 7 pounds to the gallon. So you can imagine how much weight they were carrying on this big old plane. So anyway, they fixed the gas leak. The old farmer there says, I got an old bucket in the back there, and I got some funnels, so they let them use the funnels, and they pump the gas up. They fill the airplane up, going back and forth. They pull the airplane all the way back to the end of the road. And so they decide who's going to take off. So Dale says, you take off. So Chauncey says, no, you take off. You got more experience than I do. And so Dale White takes off. And they said, when they passed the farmer, they saw the farmer waving at him. And my father said, you could feel the plane lifting in the seat of his pants. And the plane just took off. So now they're on their way. They're on their way. They're flying over Sherwood, Ohio, and the crankshaft breaks in the airplane. They make an emergency landing in Sherwood, Ohio, outside of Defiance, Ohio. They land there in back of a farmer's barn by the name of Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller was a German American, and he comes out of the barn. And so when he comes out of the barn, my father was in the front seat, Dale was in the back seat. My father jumps out of the airplane, and Dale's still in the back of the airplane. And the farmer opens up the door, and they say, my father says, this big red barn opened up, and this guy came out, and you could tell he was astonished, and this is my father's word. You could tell he was astonished to see these two brothers from Ethiopia with these flying gears on it that he had never seen before in his life. And so they said, my father says, I'm sorry, sir, but we had engine trouble. We had to land here. And so Mr. Miller says, don't worry. You're in a good old German town, and we'll help you any way we can. So they took him to Defiance, Ohio, where they called Coffey, and Coffey got a crankshaft, bearings, and Coffey then drove with, at the time, was Clyde Howard, who was going to be my father's future father-in-law and my grandfather, not knowing all this at this time. So they drive down to Defiance, Ohio, 2 days and 1 night. They put this airplane back together. They're warming it up. It's running just as great as it can run, and they're continuing on. So their next stop is they're heading into Morgantown, West Virginia. President Davis at West Virginia University had invited them down to talk to the class there to interest them into aviation. They left there, and after they left Morgantown, West Virginia, they were going to gas up. And so when they left Morgantown, they landed, and they left out of there. They were going to stay at the airport there, but the airport said, you can't stay here. It's under construction. But you can make it to Pittsburgh. It's only 50 miles. Well, they didn't have any lights. They only had 2 instruments. So they said, well, we don't have any other choice. The winds were high. The runway was under construction. So they take off. Well, they're on their way to Pittsburgh. They're flying along, and it gets dark. My father says somebody turns on the black light. So my father says to Dale, he points back. Of course, you can't talk in an airplane. He points back, and they point at a passenger airline coming in to Allegheny Airport. And so he signals to get behind this airplane and follow it in to this landing. So Dale threw his hands up. That means you're on it. My father threw his hands up. Dale said. So my father takes over the airplane. He gets behind him. He said he got about 2 city blocks behind this passenger airplane. And when this airplane, well, first of all, when you're in trouble, you're supposed to gun your engine. Run 3 sections at a time, 3 sections at a time. So he said he did it. He said they did it for about 16 times. No lights came on, no nothing. You could just see the beacon light blinking. When the passenger airline came in, the airport lit up, obviously because of radio controls. And so he got behind it. So they utilized that controls. And my father says when that passenger airline landed, my father hit that tarmac at the same time. And he said he had to switch loop it because it was headed straight for the back of that airplane. Well, they call it the FAA now. Back then they called it the CAA. The CAA was in charge of aviation before the FAA took over. And so an Inspector Goff, Goff, and I spell it because that's how my father does his interviews. And Inspector Goff came and he grounded the airplane. And they said we'd have their hearing in the morning. Now what are they going to do? They haven't made it to their destination to try to interest Congress into including the Negro into the civil pilot training program. So their support there was Robert Vann. Robert Vann was the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, and he also was a practicing attorney. So Robert Vann then supports them, and he gets his team together, and they have the hearing. Well, they call back to West Virginia, and they find out that it's true that they weren't allowed to stay there, and they had to fly on. And so Inspector Goff says, I'm going to let you fellas go this time. But if I hear about you flying within 500 miles of a passenger airplane, you'll be grounded for lifetime. They were fine with that. And as my father says in his interview, later on, they became the best of friends. So they continue on. Now they're leaving Allegheny Airport and they're coming into Washington, D.C. Edgar Brown is there waiting to welcome them. Edgar Brown had received a telegram from Ann Spencer, my father's mother. And so to meet him there and to take him into the congressional building and so on. So when they landed there, they got out and they got on the little trolley car that goes to the congressional building. While they're getting on the trolley car, there's a man waiting there to get on the trolley car, and they're getting off the trolley car. And so he says, "Good morning, Edgar. Who are your two friends here?" And so Edgar said, "Good morning, Senator. They're trying to get into the Army Air Corps." And so Chauncey Spencer says, "Yes, Senator, we're trying to get into the Army Air Corps, but it seems to be for whites only." So Senator says, "Well, where's your airplane?" And they said, "It's out at National," which I don't know what it was called then, out at the airfield there. And so he says, "Well, do you vote?" And so Chauncey Spencer and Dale White said, "Yes, we vote." "You pay your taxes?" "Yes, you pay your taxes." "You work?" "Yeah." "Well, why aren't you at work today?" Well, Chauncey Spencer says, we had to show the dramatics of the need of us being included in, so we were allowed to take a day off to do so, sir. So the senator says, "Well, how about if I come out to the airport around 3 o'clock and take a look at this plane?" So he's asking Edgar Brown. So Edgar Brown said, "What do you think, fellas?" And so the fellas, Dale White and Chauncey Spencer, said, "Sounds fine to me." So Chauncey Spencer says to me, my father tells me, he says, "Pop, I didn't think that they were going to come out there, so we were 15 minutes late. We got out there at 3:15, and Truman was out there, and 4 of his administrative assistants, and they were looking down in this airplane, and they said, 'You mean to tell me you flew this thing I'm looking at from Chicago to Washington?'" And so Chauncey Spencer says, "Yes, Senator, we did. Can we take you for a flight?" And so the senator says, "No, you can't take me for a flight. But if you got guts enough to fly this thing from Chicago to Washington, I got guts enough to find out why you can't become part of the United States Army Air Corps." So that's where we got our support. They left there and they went to a congressional meeting where they were having an appropriation for the War Department to include not African Americans, I borrowed, to include the Air Force, because Roosevelt had demanded to change the quantity of airplanes from 12,000 to 50,000 airplanes. Truman wanted 50,000 airplanes for World War II. And they thought it was impossible. But the manufacturer said it was very possible. And obviously they built them. And so during that time, Edgar Brown says he's walking into the congressional area and they have guards. My father said they have 2 armed guards standing there. And so Edgar Brown says, "Get out of my way, get out of my way. We're United States citizens." And so they stepped back. And so my father said they must have thought he was Haile Selassie or somebody. They just backed off. And so my father says, he says this purely as a joke. He says, when we walked in, they thought it was the board from the NAACP. It was silent. And so Edgar Brown gives his speech. And they asked the men 2 questions, 3 questions, 4 questions. My father said it probably wasn't minutes, but it seemed like it was hours that they were in there. They left there, and then they went out, they met Truman later on. And they told them while they were in the office that even Senator Truman is supporting their efforts, and he's coming out to the airport to look at our airplane. So they went out there, and I told you the story about how they saw the airplane. Well, they left there, and on their way out there, they had to take this scroll from Mayor Kelly to Mayor LaGuardia. So they were on their way to New York. Now, they didn't know that it was Joe Lewis's 25th birthday. And when they landed in Harlem, they landed at Floyd Bennett Airport in New York, and then they went over to Harlem. While they were there, they celebrated with Joe Louis. They invited him to thing. They had a ticker tape parade and all this stuff. And after they left there, they were to fly back to Washington. Well, on their way back to Washington, you fly over Virginia. And the James River is sort of like a serpentine. It just snakes around and stuff. If you've ever seen those rivers from the air, they look very interesting. And so my father said that he signaled to Dale. He said, "Dale, you mind if we land in Lynchburg? Because they told me that they didn't teach color to fly. And I just like to just show off a little bit and land in Lynchburg." So they contacted Ann Spencer, and Ann Spencer got the principal, CWC, to let the school out, Dunbar High School, out early to greet these pilots at the airport. So my father says when they landed there, he says that the students started rushing the plane, and he didn't know what to do, so he had to switch loop it because they were heading right for the motor. And so he said that the people there greeted him finely. He said the people there They welcomed him there. He didn't feel. See, my father's a very, very positive individual. And the only thing that we need to teach our young people is the positive parts of our history, because the negative parts of our history aren't going to teach them anything. Unless they're factual and we need to teach them something that had happened, fine. But we don't need to beat down on it, because negative is bred through our televisions and our communities. And so they don't need any help on that. They need help on directing themselves into a positive life. So my father always tells the story, which I'm going to tell, about the positive greetings that they got in Lynchburg, Virginia. Obviously, we know how things were, okay? And so we don't have to do that. We don't have to drill on what's already there. So they were welcome there. They left there. They got a telegram. The telegram was sent to Ann Spencer. Ann Spencer got a telegram from the Chicago Defender saying that their trip was successful, more than they ever expected, and they have appropriated $3 million to include the Negro into the Civil Pilot Training Program. And that inclusion was June the 21st of 1939, almost a month and so after the meeting with Harry S. Truman. If it wasn't for that meeting, as many historians say, we don't know that to be factual, but if it wasn't for that meeting with Harry S. Truman and Franklin Roosevelt dying April the 12th, 1945, meanwhile, he dismissed Henry Wallace, who was his vice president, because of his friendship with Stalin, and brought in a weakling, he thought, which was Harry S. Truman, a junior senator out of Missouri. Who would have known that he was going to be the president of the United States later on in 1945, during the time that the 101 officers from the 477 of the Tuskegee Airmen were getting ready to be court-martialed because of Colonel Seaway and his racism, that they were down in Freeman Field in that situation. So when I tell you that, I say that we can't predict how things happen. We can just hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And our history proves to be so. So when I talk about Harry Truman and I talk about Chauncey Spencer and Dale White and the National Airmen's Association and why it's important when the Tuskegee Airmen tell their story that they must tell the story first. That it shows that we do recognize and we respect the shoulders that we stand on. And we do not give all the credit to one man, because one man in this country, in this world, didn't do anything without all the other men and women of this world. And it always takes somebody before you in order to create you as to who you are.
There's another dynamic here too, and that one that people involved in community organizing always point out, that people on top are not so easily magnanimous. They need to be pushed by those on the bottom.
I agree.
That if you don't agitate, you don't get anything. As Douglas says, those who want change, if you gotta want the rain, the thunder and lightning. If you want your crops, you're going to have the rain too.
That's right.
So you're going to have some agitation. So the organization your father and Dale White and the others were involved in was in the process of agitating for change, and they were able to meet a sympathetic voice in Truman and Everett Dirksen too. I hear Everett
Dirksen, a Republican out of Illinois, public law that was brought into the actual orders, the actual order. There was the article that was written in. It was written in both Democrats, Slattery and Dirksen, the Republicans. They worked across the aisles, and these things. This is the beginning of our civil rights. I mean, civil rights starts there. When I talk about young people, and many of them can tell you about Martin Luther King, but they can't tell you about A. Philip Randolph. They may not be. They probably can't tell you about Marcus Garvey. They probably can't tell you that Marcus Garvey wasn't even an African. They probably can't even tell you Marcus Garvey wasn't even a citizen. They can't tell you that W. Du Bois gave up his citizenship to go over to Africa, and then he came back and got it back because of the level of mind and person that he was. Booker T. Washington, for instance, he had a whole different spin on how we should be treated. We might still be back in the 1940s right now if we were waiting for him to change. Somebody told me something at work, and I know that they gave me warning on what might be said, but somebody gave me a warning, and I don't think that we've come as far as we should be right now. And some of it is because of the backbone that we had up until the 1970s of strength, that we don't have that group of people any longer. We don't have those individuals. And I don't understand why this society can't understand that it's not the Malcolm X's, it's not the Martin Luther Kings, it's the Larrys, it's the Chaunceys, it's the Joes, it's the Bobs. It's people. It's the people that make the difference. The names don't make the difference. It's the people that make the effort to make it better for other people and take these sacrifices. Well, I was told, you could go somewhere, but you're very voicey on your subjects. And I told him, I said, I don't think diversity is in some of these companies like it should be. Well, you know what? You can't change anything until you get yourself in a position. We talked about that on the upstairs. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to do it my way. Maybe I'm hard-headed and maybe I'm just who I am. Is that somebody has to make the sacrifice. I'm willing to make the sacrifice for a society of people. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, well, we have to pause here.
Okay.
You have to stop. It's
Okay.
abrupt.